The Bradford legacy belongs in the right hands. My father's voice cut through the silence as he slid the thick folder across the polished mahogany table. I stared at the inheritance transfer documents in disbelief, my fingers trembling. "You're giving everything to Richard? Even the company I've been running for 5 years?" My mother wouldn't meet my eyes as she added softly, "It's what your grandfather would have wanted, Vanessa." The weight of those words crushed something inside me as I realized what they truly meant. Despite my dedication, my achievements, my education, I would never be the right hands in their eyes. Not while my brother existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you, the ornate conference room of Bradford Holdings felt suddenly airless. The familiar space where I'd conducted countless meetings, now transformed into the site of my family's ultimate betrayal. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle's skyline glittered beneath. A rare clear sky, indifferent to the devastation unfolding on the 30th floor. "I don't understand." My voice emerged steadier than I felt, fingers pressed against the cool leather portfolio containing the documents. "I've increased profits by 37%. I've expanded into 3 new markets. Grandfather, specifically, designated me as his successor." My mother's perfectly manicured hand reached for mine, but I pulled away before she could touch me. "Darling, please try to understand. The board has concerns about your approach." The subtext wasn't subtle. My approach meant refusing to lay off 58 employees during last quarter's temporary downturn. It meant implementing parental leave policies that exceeded industry standards. It meant redirecting 10% of profits to the charitable foundation I'd established in my grandmother's name. "Richard shares your father's vision," my mother continued, her voice taking on that placating tone she'd used throughout my childhood whenever I questioned the family's unspoken rules. "The transition will be smooth. You'll still have your trust fund, of course." My father checked his watch, a gesture so familiar it sparked a flood of memories. Him checking the time during my high school graduation speech, during my MBA ceremony, during the board meeting where I presented my 5-year growth strategy for the company. "We have the Peterson meeting in 20 minutes, he said to no one in particular. "Vanessa, you can take these home to review, but we need them signed by Friday." Friday, 3 days to surrender everything I'd worked for since I was 22. "And if I refuse?" The question hung in the air, dangerous and electric. My father's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a coldness I'd glimpsed only rarely throughout my life, usually directed at business rivals before he destroyed them. "The board has already voted. Your grandfather's will included provisions for succession planning that give the board authority to determine company leadership if necessary. This is a courtesy, Vanessa. Nothing more." A courtesy. I almost laughed at the audacity of calling this ambush a courtesy. I'd spent the weekend at a renewable energy conference in Portland, and in my 48-hour absence, they'd orchestrated this coup. "Richard doesn't even work for the company," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "He's been in London playing venture capitalist with his trust fund." "Your brother is returning next month to begin the transition," my mother said brightly, as if announcing a holiday surprise. "He's very excited about the opportunity." "I bet he is," I thought bitterly. My younger brother had spent his entire life being groomed as the Bradford heir apparent, despite showing no interest in the family business until now that I'd made it profitable again, now that the hardest work was done. "You'll still have an advisory role, of course," my father added, his attention already shifting to the documents in front of him, matter closed. "Your experience will be valuable during the transition." My experience. 5 years of 70-hour weeks. 5 years of navigating the company through a recession, a supply chain crisis, and a complete digital transformation. 5 years of earning the respect of employees who initially saw me as nothing more than the boss's privileged daughter. All to be relegated to advisor to my brother, who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a bedsheet. The conference room door opened, and my father's executive assistant appeared with a carefully neutral expression. "Mr. Bradford, the Peterson Group has arrived early. They're waiting in the main reception area." "Thank you, Helen. We'll be right there." He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with the practiced motion of a man who'd spent decades in boardrooms. "Vanessa, we can discuss the details later if you have questions. Your mother and I are hosting the Wilsons for dinner tonight. You remember Connor Wilson? He's taken over his father's firm. You should join us." The casual pivot to social matchmaking in the midst of this betrayal was so absurd I couldn't immediately respond. My mother brightened at my father's suggestion. "Yes, do come, darling. Connor's been asking about you. He's divorced now, you know." Of course he was asking about me. Connor Wilson, with his family's legal empire and strategically disheveled hair, perpetually on the hunt for advantageous connections. 3 months ago, my status as Bradford Holdings CEO would have made me an appealing prospect. Now I was being downgraded to potential trophy wife. "I have plans," I lied, gathering my things with deliberate slowness, unwilling to let them see how completely they'd devastated me. "Don't wait up." My mother's face fell in practiced disappointment. "Another rain check? That's the 3rd dinner you've missed this month." Because every family dinner lately had featured subtle digs about my management style, pointed questions about why I wasn't dating, and thinly veiled suggestions that perhaps the demands of running a corporation were too much pressure for me. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Those dinners hadn't been family gatherings. They'd been reconnaissance missions, testing my defenses, looking for signs of weakness they could exploit to justify this takeover. "I have a company to run," I replied, the irony of the statement not lost on me. "At least for the next few days." My father's jaw tightened at my tone. "This attitude is precisely why the board supports our decision, Vanessa. Business isn't personal. It's about what's best for the company." I stared at him, this man who'd taught me my first lessons about finance using monopoly money, who'd once seemed 10 feet tall and infallible. Now I saw him clearly, a man so entrenched in outdated thinking that he couldn't recognize innovation when it was saving his own company. "You're right, Father. Business isn't personal." I picked up the folder without opening it. "Is there anything else?" My mother's perfectly lined lips parted as if to say something more, but my father shook his head slightly, their decades-old signal that a topic was closed for discussion. "We'll see you Friday then," he said, already moving toward the door, my mother falling into step beside him like a choreographed dance they'd performed countless times. I remained seated as they left, staring at the Seattle skyline beyond the glass. The Bradford building stood at the center of my view, 28 floors of steel and glass that had been our family's legacy for 3 generations. My grandfather had placed his weathered hands on my shoulders on my college graduation day and told me, "Someday, this will all be yours to protect and grow." Lies, it seemed, ran in the family. I waited until I was certain they'd reached the reception area before allowing the first tear to fall. Just one, a single hot streak of rage and betrayal that I quickly wiped away. There would be time for grief later. Now, I needed clarity. I opened the folder and began reading the documents that would strip me of my birthright, my professional achievements, and my future as I'd planned it. With each page, my initial shock crystallized into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous to the Bradford family: resolve. They wanted me to surrender gracefully, to sign away my inheritance with a dutiful smile, and step aside for Richard, Golden Boy Richard, who'd never worked a day in his life, who'd blown through 2 trust funds before turning 30. My hands stopped trembling as I closed the folder without signing anything. If my parents and the board thought I would simply fade into the background of the Bradford family portrait, they had grossly miscalculated. I might be losing my inheritance, but they were about to lose something far more valuable: me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The elevator doors closed on the 34th floor, sealing me in blissful solitude for the 17-second descent to the parking garage. Only then did I allow my composure to crack, my reflection in the polished brass panels showing a woman I barely recognized, pale, hollow-eyed, with a muscle twitching at the corner of my jaw. I pressed the emergency stop button between floors 23 and 22, and the elevator jolted to a halt. The sudden silence was deafening. "Breathe," I whispered to myself, resting my forehead against the cool metal wall. "Just breathe." But each breath felt inadequate, as if my lungs had shrunk, unable to take in enough oxygen to fuel the rage and grief battling for dominance inside me. My stomach twisted with nausea, and I pressed my palm flat against my abdomen, willing away the physical manifestations of this betrayal. 5 years. For 5 years, I'd poured every ounce of my being into saving the company my grandfather had built from nothing. I'd postponed dating, declined vacations, missed friends' weddings, all to resurrect Bradford Holdings from the near bankruptcy my father's outdated business model had created. And now, with the company finally thriving, they were handing it to Richard on a silver platter. Richard, who'd called me 3 months ago from a yacht in Monaco to ask whether hostile takeover meant the same thing as aggressive acquisition. Richard, who still used our family accountant to manage his personal finances because he couldn't be bothered to learn the difference between stocks and bonds. Richard, whose greatest business accomplishment to date was investing in a friend's doomed cryptocurrency venture because the logo looked cool. My phone vibrated against my hip. I pulled it out to see my assistant Dakota's name flashing on the screen, followed immediately by a text. "Peterson meeting started 10 minutes ago. Your father told everyone you had a personal emergency. You okay?" Dakota, one of the few people at Bradford who knew exactly how much work I'd done to save the company. One of the many employees who would now answer to my brother, a man who viewed the workforce as overhead rather than assets. The mere thought of returning to that conference room, of sitting through a meeting pretending everything was normal while the vultures circled, was unthinkable. I texted back, "Taking the rest of the day. Please reschedule my appointments." Then I released the emergency stop, the elevator resuming its descent with a gentle lurch. By the time I reached my car, a sensible luxury sedan rather than the flashy sports cars Richard cycled through like seasonal wardrobes, my hands had stopped shaking. The trembling had migrated deeper, settling somewhere behind my sternum, a persistent vibration like a tuning fork struck against bone. I didn't consciously decide where to drive. My body operated on autopilot, guiding the car out of downtown Seattle, across Lake Washington, and onto the winding roads of Mercer Island. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the circular driveway of my grandfather's estate, my childhood refuge, now shuttered and silent in the 3 months since his passing. The caretaker, Mr. Finley, appeared from the side garden as I cut the engine. His weathered face registered surprise, then concern as he took in my appearance. "Miss Vanessa." He wiped soil from his hands onto his work pants. "Wasn't expecting you today." "I wasn't expecting to be here," I admitted. The first honest words I'd spoken all day. Understanding dawned in his faded blue eyes. Mr. Finley had worked for my grandfather for over 40 years. Little happened in the Bradford family that escaped his notice. "They told you about the changes, then?" Not a question. He shook his head slightly, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "You knew?" My voice caught embarrassingly on the second word. "Overheard your father and Mr. Richard discussing it last week when they came to inventory the house contents." He looked pained. Not my place to say anything, but didn't sit right with me. Not after how your grandfather always spoke of you. The knowledge that the decision had been made days, perhaps weeks, ago, that everyone had been discussing my professional execution behind my back while I worked 14-hour days to finalize the Peterson deal, sent a fresh wave of betrayal crashing through me. "I'd like to go inside," I said, unable to discuss it further without risking tears. Mr. Finley retrieved the spare key from his cottage and walked me to the imposing mahogany doors. "I'll be in the gardens if you need anything," he said, patting my shoulder awkwardly before retreating down the flagstone path. The house smelled of lemon polish and the faint, lingering scent of my grandfather's pipe tobacco, a scent that had clung to him despite my grandmother's decades-long campaign to make him quit. I moved through the grand foyer into the library, the room where I'd spent countless afternoons learning at my grandfather's knee, while my parents attended their endless social obligations, and Richard pursued whatever fleeting interest captured his attention that month. Everything remained exactly as grandfather had left it. Leather-bound books lining the walls, his reading glasses perched atop an open volume of maritime history, the ancient globe he'd inherited from his own father still positioned beside his favorite armchair. The only difference was the layer of dust coating every surface, as if the house itself had begun to fade in his absence. I sank into his chair, the leather creaking in familiar welcome. Above the fireplace hung the only formal portrait my grandfather had ever commissioned, not of himself, but of the original Bradford building as it appeared in 1963, when he'd completed construction after a decade of setbacks and near bankruptcy. "Property is just land and buildings, Vanessa," he'd told me once, his voice gruff with emotion as he recounted how close he'd come to losing everything. "But a legacy? That's built on vision and grit." What would he say now, knowing his son and grandson had conspired to strip his chosen successor of her rightful place? The thought sent a fresh surge of grief through me. I pulled out my phone, finally ready to read the documents that had been thrust upon me. The file detailed the transition plan with clinical precision. Richard would assume the title of CEO within 30 days. I would retain a nominal position as strategic advisor, with a compensation package generous enough to maintain my lifestyle but devoid of any actual authority. The Bradford family holdings, the commercial real estate portfolio, the majority stake in the company, the various investments and assets accumulated over 3 generations would transfer entirely to Richard, with the exception of my personal trust fund and a courtesy ownership stake of 5% in the company. My grandfather's house, this sanctuary where I sat, would be sold, the proceeds invested in Richard's new vision for Bradford Holdings' expansion. Page after page of legal jargon essentially erased my existence from the company narrative, reducing 5 years of leadership to a footnote in the Bradford family history. At the bottom of the final page, 3 signature lines awaited: my father's, already signed, Richard's, already signed, and mine, blank, awaiting the surrender of everything I'd worked for. Outside the library windows, the afternoon sun glinted, off Lake Washington, casting diamonds of light across the manicured lawn stretching down to the private dock where my grandfather had taught me to sail. A lifetime of memories contained in a property soon to be liquidated to fund my brother's business whims. I set the phone down and closed my eyes, allowing the familiar scents and sounds of the house to wash over me. In the distance, I could hear Mr. Finley's shears as he trimmed the hedges, the rhythmic snipping oddly comforting in its normalcy. Then, cutting through my grief like a blade, came a new emotion. Not the helpless rage of the conference room or the stunned disbelief of the elevator, but something clearer and more dangerous: determination. My grandfather hadn't built his empire by accepting defeat. He hadn't survived the recession of the 1970s, the market crash of 1987, or the tech bubble burst by surrendering when circumstances turned against him, and neither would I. I opened my eyes, a plan already forming. I had 3 days until Friday's deadline. 3 days to engineer a response my family would never see coming. I picked up my phone and made a call to the one person who might understand what I was feeling. The one person who'd witnessed the Bradford dynasty from the outside and could offer perspective untainted by family politics. "Mira," I said when she answered, "I need your help." Mira Chen arrived at the estate an hour later, her electric blue Tesla looking distinctly out of place among the stately grounds. A tech entrepreneur who'd sold her first startup at 26, Mira had been my roommate at business school and remained my closest friend despite, or perhaps because of, her complete disinterest in the social circles my family inhabited. "Holy hell," she said by way of greeting, wrapping me in a fierce hug before stepping back to examine my face. "You look like you've been hit by a bus. A expensive, tastefully upholstered bus, but still a bus." The blunt assessment startled. A laugh from me, the sound rusty and unfamiliar in the quiet house. I led her through to the kitchen, where I'd made coffee in the elaborate espresso machine my grandmother had insisted on installing, despite my grandfather's protests that it was unnecessarily complicated. "So they're giving everything to Richard?" Mira confirmed after I'd outlined the situation, her expression darkening with each detail. "The same Richard who once tried to pay for dinner with his gym membership card?" "The very same." I wrapped my hands around my mug, drawing what comfort I could from its warmth. Apparently, running tampons and aspirin to his hungover one-night stands constitutes better preparation for corporate leadership than an MBA and 5 years of C-suite experience. Mira scowled. "This is so Bradford family it makes my teeth hurt. Remember when they seated you at the children's table at that charity gala? You were 30 and had just closed the Westlake acquisition." The memory brought a reluctant smile to my lips. My mother had insisted it was an innocent mistake by the event planners, but I'd seen her careful examination of the seating chart the night before. "At least the kids had better conversation than my father's golf buddies," I replied, before sobering. "This is different, though. This isn't just a social slight. This is my entire professional identity. Not to mention the obscene amount of money," Mira added pragmatically. "What's Bradford Holdings worth these days? 4 billion? 5? Just under 6 after the Peterson deal closes," I said automatically, then stopped as the full weight of what I was losing crashed over me. Again, not that it was ever about the money. "Of course not," Mira agreed, though her raised eyebrows suggested she thought the money was a pretty significant factor. "It was about proving yourself to people who were never going to see you as good enough, no matter what you accomplished." Her words hit with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, exposing the wound I'd spent a lifetime pretending didn't exist. From my earliest memories, I'd been trying to earn the approval my parents bestowed effortlessly on Richard. Every academic achievement, every professional milestone had been driven by the desperate hope that this, finally, would be enough to make them see me. "That's not fair," I protested weakly. "Isn't it?" Mira countered, her dark eyes unflinching. "How many nights did I talk you down during business school when you were killing yourself to graduate first in our class? How many times have you canceled plans because your father needed something done immediately that somehow only you could handle?" I stared into my coffee, unable to deny the truth of her assessment. The pattern stretched back as far as I could. Remember, my desperate attempts to earn validation and my family's expert ability to move the goalposts just beyond my reach. "Do you remember the summer before junior year of high school?" I asked suddenly, surprising myself with the memory that surfaced. Mira shook her head. "We didn't meet until Northwestern. It was the summer my grandfather first started taking me seriously." I traced patterns in the condensation on the marble countertop. I'd spent years watching him teach Richard about the business, bringing him to meetings, showing him blueprints, explaining contracts. I was always just there. Background furniture. The ache of those years remained surprisingly sharp, despite the decades that had passed. Hours spent reading quietly in corners of my grandfather's office, absorbing everything but included in nothing. That summer, Richard was supposed to intern at Bradford Holdings, but he got an offer to work as a production assistant on a friend's indie film in California. My father was furious. They had this big fight about responsibility and obligation. Richard left anyway. I could still see my brother's triumphant expression as he'd thrown his duffel bag into his friend's convertible, speeding away from family expectations with the carefree confidence of someone who knew he'd be forgiven any transgression. My grandfather needed someone to organize his files. Boring, basic stuff. I volunteered. The memory warmed me even now. He was reluctant at first, didn't think I'd stick with it. But I worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. By August, I'd not only organized everything, I'd created a digital database for his records and identified 3 lease agreements that were underperforming. Mira's expression softened. So that's where it started, your relationship with the company. I nodded. My grandfather took me to dinner at Canlis to celebrate, told me I had good instincts. It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged that I might have something valuable to contribute. And your parents? Mira asked, already knowing the answer. My mother wondered why I was hiding in dusty filing cabinets instead of enjoying my youth. My father said it was cute, that I was playing at business. The dismissal had stung, but my grandfather's quiet pride had been enough to sustain me. When Richard came back from California without ever having worked on the film, he'd spent the summer surfing instead. They threw him a welcome home party. Mira reached across the counter to squeeze my hand. Classic Bradford. And yet you still went into the family business. Because of my grandfather, I said simply. He believed in me when no one else did. After that summer, he included me in everything, taught me, challenged me, supported me. He's the reason I went to business school instead of pursuing art history. Art history, my secret passion, abandoned for Bradford Holdings. Sometimes I still dreamed about the alternative path, curating exhibits, writing scholarly articles, spending days immersed in beauty rather than balance sheets, a world away from profit margins and board meetings. And now they're dismantling his legacy, Mira said, bringing me back to the present crisis. Giving Richard control after your grandfather specifically chose you as his successor. According. To my father, the succession plan was always flexible. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. Apparently, that clause about board authority was meant to ensure the company remained under proper leadership. Proper meaning male, Mira translated flatly. I couldn't deny it. For all his progressive business strategies, my grandfather had been a man of his generation. He'd believed in me, mentored me, chosen me as his successor. But he'd left that fatal loophole in his will, perhaps never imagining my father would exploit it against his own daughter. So what now? Mira asked, draining her coffee and setting the mug down with decisive finality. Please tell me you're not just going to sign those papers. I met her gaze, feeling clarity solidify within me like crystal forming in solution. I called you because I need perspective, not consolation. And because what I'm considering might burn every bridge I have with my family. Mira's slow smile was positively wolfish. Now we're talking. What exactly did you have in mind? I pulled out my phone and showed her the email I'd drafted but not yet sent. A message to Bradford Holdings' 5 largest clients, the relationships I'd personally cultivated over the past 5 years. That's a good start. Mira nodded approvingly. But if you really want to fight this, you need leverage. What kind of leverage can I possibly have? They control the board, the shares, the legal team, everything. Mira's expression turned calculating. Not everything. You control the relationships that keep Bradford Holdings profitable. You control the institutional knowledge of how the company actually functions. And most importantly, she paused, tapping her perfectly manicured nail against the counter. You control your own narrative. Meaning? Meaning it's time to stop playing by Bradford rules. Mira straightened, energy practically radiating from her compact frame. Your whole life, you've tried to win their game on their terms. But what if you changed the game entirely? The question hung between us, dangerous and exhilarating in its possibilities. I don't even know where to start, I admitted. Mira glanced at her watch. Well, we have exactly 62 hours until your Friday deadline. I suggest we start by figuring out exactly what you want. What I want? The question struck me as absurdly simple, yet profoundly complex. Yes, Vanessa. Not what would make your parents proud, or what your grandfather would have wanted, or what Bradford Holdings needs. Her voice gentled. What do you, Vanessa, Elizabeth Bradford, want for your own life? No one had asked me that question in so long that I wasn't sure I remembered how to answer it. By midnight, my grandfather's library had transformed into a war room. Takeout containers from Mira's favorite Thai restaurant littered the antique desk, and 3 laptops glowed in the dimness, casting our faces in electronic blue light. We'd been joined by Dakota, my assistant, whose organizational skills were matched only by her loyalty, and Nate Harrington, Bradford Holdings legal counsel, and more importantly, my grandfather's personal attorney before joining the company. They can't actually force you to sign, Nate confirmed, his bow tie loosened after hours of reviewing documents. At 58, he was one of the few executives who predated my tenure at Bradford. But they don't need your signature to execute. The board's decision. Friday is more symbolic than legally significant. Symbolic matters to the Bradfords, Dakota commented, not looking up from her screen where she was compiling a dossier of my achievements as CEO. Mr. Bradford Sr. is all about appearances. She wasn't wrong. My father cared deeply about how things looked, about the narrative presented to the world. It was why he'd insisted I attend cotillion despite my protests. Why our family Christmas cards always featured color-coordinated outfits. Why he'd spent a fortune renovating our family pew at St. Mark's Cathedral, even though we attended services only twice a year. So I could refuse to sign, I said slowly, but the outcome remains the same. With one significant difference, Nate corrected, leaning forward. Refusing to sign means you're not agreeing to the non-compete clause buried on page 17. Mira's head snapped up. Non-compete? You didn't mention that. Because I didn't get that far in the document, I admitted. What kind of non-compete? Nate's expression was grim. The scorched earth variety. 5 years. Nationwide prohibition on working in commercial real estate development, property management, or corporate consulting. Essentially bars you from any industry where you might compete with Bradford Holdings. That's outrageous, Mira protested. No court would enforce something that broad. They might not have to, Nate said. The penalty for violation includes forfeiture of your trust fund and that 5% ownership stake they're generously leaving you. The pieces clicked into terrible clarity. So they're not just removing me from the company. They're trying to ensure I can't establish a competing business or work with Bradford's clients in any capacity. Precisely. Nate removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose wearily. It's unusually punitive language, even for a family business transition. Dakota looked up from her laptop, her expression troubled. They're afraid of you. The simple observation hung in the air, resonating with unexpected truth. They were afraid. Not of me personally, but of what I represented. Of the changes I'd implemented, the innovations I'd championed, the old guard I'd gradually replaced with more diverse, forward-thinking leadership. I've spent 5 years dragging Bradford Holdings into the 21st century, I said slowly, and they've spent that same time resisting every step. Nate nodded. Your father and the old guard on the board were particularly unhappy about the Westlake acquisition. Using company capital to purchase that arts district for rehabilitation rather than luxury condos. That arts district is projected to return 17% on investment over 5 years while providing affordable studio spaces for local artists and generating positive community engagement, I countered, the familiar defense rising automatically to my lips. I know, Nate said gently. But your father called it charity masquerading as business in at least 3 board meetings. Another piece of the puzzle slid into place. My passion project, the development that combined my secret love of art with sound business principles, had been the final straw for my father. He couldn't understand why anyone would prioritize community impact alongside profit margins. So, what are my options? I asked, trying to focus on solutions rather than the growing sense of betrayal. From a legal standpoint? Limited, Nate admitted. Your grandfather's will contains that succession planning clause. The board has voted, and the family shares are aligned against you. Fighting it directly would be an uphill battle with minimal chance of success. Then we don't fight directly, Mira interjected, her expression fierce in the laptop glow. We need to think asymmetrically. Dakota straightened, her fingers poised over her keyboard. What if we looked at this not as keeping your position at Bradford, but as negotiating your exit on your terms? The suggestion initially stung. It felt like surrender. But as I considered it, a new possibility emerged. What would that look like? For starters, rejection of the non-compete, Nate said immediately. That's non-negotiable. Full severance. As outlined in your employment contract, Dakota added, already typing. That's 2 years' salary plus performance bonuses. Public acknowledgement of your contributions, Mira contributed. A press release that properly credits your leadership over the past 5 years. And the Westlake Arts District, I said. Quietly, the idea forming as I spoke it. I want Bradford Holdings to sell it to me at fair market value. 3 pairs of eyes turned to me with varying degrees of surprise. The Arts District? Dakota questioned. That's worth approximately $78 million based on the last valuation, I supplied. Well, within the range of what my trust fund could cover, especially if I liquidate some of my personal investments. They'll never agree to sell you their most controversial asset, Nate warned. Richard has already mentioned redeveloping it as luxury retail in at least 2 planning meetings. That's precisely why I want it, I replied, feeling more confident with each word. It's the project that represents everything they're rejecting about my vision for Bradford. If I can't preserve that vision within the company, I want to preserve it on my own terms. Mira was watching me with growing approval. Now you're thinking like a Chen instead of a Bradford, but we need leverage to make these demands. The Peterson deal, Dakota said suddenly. It hasn't closed yet, and you're the primary relationship manager. They specifically requested you lead the acquisition. Nate straightened, his legal mind clearly assessing this angle. If Peterson pulled out, it would decrease Bradford's projected quarterly earnings by nearly 18%. The stock would take a significant hit. I can't sabotage a deal I worked for months to secure, I protested. That's not ethical. Not sabotage, Dakota clarified. But you could request a meeting with Sarah Peterson tomorrow to inform her of the leadership changes, transparency about a significant management transition that might affect their acquisition. That's not just ethical, it's expected. And if Sarah Peterson happens to express concerns about proceeding under new leadership? Mira trailed off suggestively. I'm not comfortable manipulating clients, I said firmly. It's not manipulation, to be honest, Dakota countered. The Petersons chose Bradford Holdings largely because of your reputation and vision. They deserve to know that vision is changing. She had a point. The Peterson family had specifically cited my environmental commitments and community-centered development approach as key factors in selecting Bradford over our competitors. There's another avenue we haven't discussed, Nate said carefully. The minority shareholders. I frowned. The 15% not controlled by the family? They're scattered across dozens of investors, mostly longtime family friends and business associates. Yes, but they still have voting rights, Nate pointed out. And while they can't override the board's decision about CEO succession, they could create significant pressure if they believed the transition was being handled poorly. How? I asked, intrigued despite my reservations. A minority shareholder action expressing no confidence in the transition plan could delay implementation, force additional disclosure, even trigger a special meeting, Nate explained. It wouldn't stop Richard from eventually taking over, but it would create enough complications that your father might be more amenable to negotiating favorable exit terms. The strategy was beginning to take shape, not a frontal assault on the board's decision, but a series of pressure points that might force my family to treat me with the respect I'd earned. We need to act quickly, Dakota said, checking her watch. If we're meeting with the Petersons tomorrow, I need to arrange that first thing in the morning. And I'll need to discreetly contact key minority shareholders, Nate added. There are at least 3 who have expressed concerns about Richard's business acumen in the past. Mira closed her laptop with decisive finality. This is good, but it's still too reactive. We need something that puts you in a position of strength, not just fending off the worst outcomes. What do you suggest? I asked, recognizing the gleam in her eye that had preceded some of her most brilliant business maneuvers. You need to create an alternative, she said simply. Not just walking away from Bradford with your trust fund intact, but walking towards something new. Something that demonstrates exactly what they're losing by pushing you out. A competing company? The idea seemed simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Better, Mira countered. A new vision entirely. Something that capitalizes on your strengths and experience but isn't just Bradford 2.0. She gestured to the arts district plans spread across the desk. You've always been passionate about the intersection of business and culture. What if you built something around that? The possibility unfurled in my mind like a map to an undiscovered country. A development firm focused on cultural preservation and community enhancement, combining profitability with purpose. Cultural Impact Partners, I said softly, the name materializing fully formed. Specializing in adaptive reuse of historic properties for arts and community spaces. Dakota was already typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I can have domain names secured and preliminary branding concepts by morning. I know at least 3 investors who would back you immediately, Mira added. People who tried to partner with Bradford but were turned away because the projects were too niche for your father's taste. For the first time since sitting in that conference room watching my future disintegrate, I felt something like hope kindling in my chest. Not just the determination to fight back, but genuine excitement about what might lie beyond Bradford Holdings. We need to be careful, Nate cautioned. Until we've negotiated the terms of your departure, any concrete steps toward a competing venture could strengthen their position on the non-compete. So, we prepare everything, but don't formally launch until after negotiations are complete. Mira summarized. Dakota, you'll need to use personal email for anything related to Cultural Impact Partners. And Vanessa, absolutely no company resources or devices for this planning. I nodded, the seriousness of our gambit settling over me. We were formulating a sophisticated exit strategy in less than 72 hours, challenging one of Seattle's oldest family dynasties. If we miscalculated, I could lose everything, the company, my trust fund, even my professional reputation. But the alternative, silently accepting my family's betrayal, watching as Richard dismantled my achievements, was unthinkable. There's something else we should discuss, Dakota said hesitantly. Your brother arrives from London tomorrow evening. Your mother has organized a welcome dinner at Canlis, the same restaurant where my grandfather had first recognized my potential. The symmetry was painfully perfect. I wasn't invited, I said flatly. Dakota's expression confirmed what I already suspected. The reservation is for 4. Your parents, Richard and Bradley Wilson. Bradley Wilson? The real estate reporter for the Seattle Business Journal? Nate asked, alarmed. They're already planning the press rollout. The final insult, they would announce Richard's ascension over premium Wagyu and $100 bottles of wine, crafting the public narrative of a smooth, planned succession, while erasing my contributions entirely. Then we need to control our own narrative, I said, my voice steady despite the anger churning beneath it. Dakota, contact Lucia Reyes at Innovator Magazine. See if she's available for breakfast tomorrow. Lucia had been trying to profile me for months, a feature on women transforming Seattle's business landscape. I'd repeatedly delayed, uncomfortable with the personal spotlight. That reluctance now seemed like yet another concession to Bradford family values, another way I'd diminished myself to maintain peace. No more. It's nearly 2 a.m, I said, surveying our makeshift command center. We should get some rest. Tomorrow will be a decisive day. As Nate and Dakota gathered their things, Mira pulled me aside, her expression serious. Are you sure you're ready for this? Once we start, there's no going back to how things were with your family. I glanced around the library, at the shelves of books my grandfather had collected over a lifetime, at the portrait of the building that bore our family name, at the legacy I'd fought to preserve and evolve. Things already changed the moment. They decided Richard deserved everything I've worked for, I replied. Now it's time they learned what I'm really worth. Morning arrived with brutal swiftness. After 3 hours of fitful sleep on my grandfather's leather sofa, I awoke to the gentle chime of my phone alarm and the less gentle reality of what lay ahead. Mr. Finley had thoughtfully left fresh towels in the guest bathroom, and I showered, quickly, mentally rehearsing my approach for the day's confrontations. My overnight bag in the car contained one business outfit, a charcoal gray suit I'd planned to wear to the Peterson meeting before my world imploded. It would have to do for both breakfast with Lucia Reyes and whatever corporate battles awaited at Bradford Holdings. As I dressed, my phone lit up with messages. Dakota confirming Lucia had eagerly accepted the breakfast invitation. Mira sending a securely encrypted folder of preliminary business plans for cultural impact partners. Nate advising caution in my meeting with the Petersons. And a text from my mother. Darling, have you had a chance to review those documents? Your father would like to discuss your thoughts before the dinner with Richard tonight. No mention of the fact that I hadn't been invited to said dinner. No acknowledgement of the monumental betrayal their documents represented. Just the same breezy assumption that I would fall in line, as I always had. I left the message unanswered. Lucia Reyes was already seated at Oddfellows when I arrived, her recorder and notebook arranged precisely beside her coffee cup. At 42, she had established herself as the preeminent chronicler of Seattle's business evolution, with a particular focus on underrepresented voices in the corporate landscape. This is unexpected, she said after we exchanged greetings, her shrewd eyes taking in my expression. I've been trying to get this interview for months. Timing is everything in business, I replied, settling into the chair across from her. And recent developments at Bradford Holdings have made this the perfect moment for a conversation about leadership transitions. Her eyebrows rose slightly. Leadership transitions? That's not language I expected from someone who's spent the past 5 years revitalizing a legacy company. Sometimes revitalization requires more radical change than a single company can. Accommodate, I said carefully. Bradford Holdings has been my professional home, but I'm beginning to envision new possibilities. Lucia's journalistic instincts visibly sharpened. She reached for her recorder. Mind if I capture this conversation? Not at all. In fact, I hope you'll consider this the first exclusive on what comes next. For the next 45 minutes, I outlined my vision for cultural development, the philosophy I'd attempted to implement at Bradford, but had been increasingly constrained from pursuing fully. I shared success metrics from the Westlake Arts District, explained how community-centered development could generate both social and financial returns, and hinted at future ventures that would expand on these principles. What I didn't share were the ugly details of my ousting. The narrative I presented was one of natural evolution, a dedicated executive ready to build something new after successfully stabilizing a family company. "This sounds like more than a theoretical exercise," Lucia observed astutely, pausing. The recorder. "Are you actually leaving Bradford?" I met her gaze steadily. "I'm exploring opportunities that align more completely with my vision for ethical development. I believe there's space in Seattle for a company that prioritizes cultural preservation alongside profit. And Bradford Holdings doesn't share that belief? Bradford has certain established perspectives on development," I replied diplomatically. "Change within legacy institutions happens gradually. Or not at all," Lucia added with knowing skepticism. She'd covered enough family businesses to recognize the euphemisms for resistance to change. "The article will run next week," I confirmed. As we concluded, "Given what you've shared, I'd like to fast-track it for Friday's digital edition," Lucia countered. "This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach our readers are interested in." Friday, the same day I was supposed to sign away my inheritance. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Friday would be ideal, I agreed. As I walked from Oddfellows to Bradford Holdings' headquarters, I felt strangely calm. The pieces were in motion now. Whatever happened in the next 8 hours, I would face it with clarity of purpose rather than the shocked betrayal of yesterday. The receptionist's surprise at seeing me walk into the building should have been my first warning. The security guard who suddenly appeared at her desk, ostensibly to deliver mail, was the second. But it wasn't until I approached the executive elevator and found my access card denied that I fully understood the situation. They had already begun erasing me. I took out my phone and called Dakota's direct line. "Where are you?" she asked. Immediately, her voice hushed. "Lobby. My access has been revoked. They moved fast after you left yesterday. It has been instructed to migrate your email and files to a secure server, and security has a modified access list for the executive floor." Her efficiency in gathering intelligence never failed to impress me. I've been fielding calls all morning from clients who received an email announcing Richard as the new CEO, effective immediately. The timeline had accelerated dramatically. My Friday deadline had been nothing but theater. They had already executed the transition plan behind my back. "The Peterson meeting?" I asked. "Still on the calendar for 11. Your father is planning to lead it." Of course he was. With his golf buddy Bradley Wilson prepped to announce Richard's ascension that evening, my father needed to secure the Peterson deal before any questions about leadership stability could arise. "I need you to message Sarah Peterson directly. Tell her I'd like to meet privately before the official gathering. The cafe across the street, 10:30. "Already done," Dakota replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. She responded immediately, said she'd be there. Also, Nate wants you to know he's spoken with 2 minority shareholders. They're concerned about the abrupt transition and have requested a special information session before approving the Peterson acquisition. Another piece falling into place. And my father? Currently in what appears to be a heated call with Richard. From what I could hear passing his office, there's concern about the timing of Richard's flight. Apparently, he missed his connection in New York and won't arrive until just before the dinner. So my golden boy brother was complicating matters with his typical lack of reliability. Small consolation, but I'd take it. "I need access to the building for the Peterson meeting," I said, watching as another security guard joined the first, both pretending not to observe me. "Use the service entrance on 3rd. Maintenance owes me a favor. I'll have someone meet you there at 10:15. By 10:45, I was seated across from Sarah Peterson in the quiet corner of Cafe Argento. At 56, Sarah had inherited her family's manufacturing business during the 2008 financial crisis and not only saved it from bankruptcy, but transformed it into one of the Northwest's most innovative sustainable product companies. Her silver bob and practical attire belied both her wealth and her razor-sharp business acumen. "This is unexpected," she said, echoing Lucia's earlier sentiment, "especially given the email I received this morning announcing your successor." "That's precisely why I wanted to meet privately," I replied. "The transition is happening more abruptly than anticipated." Sarah studied me over her espresso. The email described a long-planned succession. "Your father characterized it as the culmination of a carefully orchestrated leadership development process." The description was so absurd I couldn't suppress a brief, bitter laugh. Is that what he called Richard's decade of interrupted education, failed startups, and extended European vacations? Leadership development? Sarah's expression softened slightly. I suspected the official narrative might be somewhat sanitized. Bradford family dynamics have always been subject to interpretation. The diplomatic phrasing reminded me why Sarah was such a formidable negotiator. She could convey volumes of skepticism without a single impolite word. "The truth is rather less orchestrated," I admitted. "I was informed of this transition yesterday. It was not mutual, not planned, and certainly not my idea." "I see." Sarah set down her cup with deliberate precision. "And you're telling me this because you deserve transparency from a business partner, and because the vision and values that attracted Peterson Manufacturing to Bradford Holdings are about to change significantly. You're suggesting we reconsider the acquisition." "I'm providing context so you can make fully informed decisions," I corrected carefully. The Peterson deal was structured around sustainability principles and community investment thresholds that aligned with my leadership priorities. I cannot guarantee my brother shares those priorities. Sarah leaned back, her expression calculating. "Would it surprise you to know that your father called me personally this morning to assure me that all aspects of our agreement remain unchanged?" "It wouldn't surprise me at all. My father excels at saying whatever is necessary to close a deal." "And yet Peterson Manufacturing has partnered successfully with Bradford Holdings for nearly 40 years. With my grandfather," I clarified, "who, for all his traditional perspectives, was a man of absolute integrity. That partnership predates my father's leadership." Sarah nodded slowly, acknowledging the distinction. "Your grandfather spoke highly of you, you know. The last time we met, must have been 8 months before he passed, he told me you were the future of Bradford, that you understood what the company needed to become." The unexpected validation from beyond the grave brought a tightness to my throat that I struggled to control. "I believed that too," I managed finally. "I was wrong. Perhaps." Sarah gathered her things, signaling the end of our conversation. "Or perhaps the future takes unexpected forms. The acquisition meeting begins in 10 minutes. Will you be attending?" The question carried layers of meaning beyond its practical implications. Would I participate in the corporate theater of a smooth transition? Would I maintain the facade of Bradford family unity? Would I surrender quietly to preserve business relationships I'd spent years building? "No," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke it. "I've said what I needed to say. What happens next is entirely up to Peterson Manufacturing." Sarah stood, extending her hand. "It's been a pleasure working with you, Vanessa. I suspect we'll have opportunities to collaborate again, though perhaps in different capacities." As she left, I noticed a familiar figure at a table near the window, my father, watching our interaction with undisguised alarm. How long he'd been there, I couldn't say, but his presence confirmed what I'd already suspected. He had never intended to honor the Friday deadline. The board vote had likely happened before I'd even been informed of the decision. The game had been rigged from the start, but now, finally, I was playing by my own rules. I watched my father hurry out of the cafe, phone already pressed to his ear as he headed toward the Bradford building. Whatever damage control he was initiating would occupy him for at least the next hour, giving me a narrow window of opportunity. My own phone vibrated with an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. "Vanessa Bradford," I answered, moving toward the exit. "Ms. Bradford, this is Harriet Moss from Seattle First Bank." The woman's crisp, professional tone carried a note of concern. "I'm calling regarding some unusual activity on your accounts." I paused on the sidewalk, pedestrians flowing around me like water around a stone. "What kind of unusual activity?" "There appears to be a freeze request on your personal accounts as well as your trust fund. It was submitted this morning with what seems to be appropriate authorization, but given the nature of the request and the substantial sums involved, our protocol requires direct confirmation with the account holder." Cold understanding washed over me. They weren't just removing me from the company, they were attempting to cut off my financial resources as well. "I did not authorize any freeze on my accounts," I said firmly. "Who submitted the request?" A brief pause. "The request came from Bradford Holdings' financial department, co-signed by your father as trustee." "Trustee?" I repeated incredulously. "I'm 34 years old. My trust converted to direct control on my 30th birthday." Another pause, longer this time, filled with the sound of keyboard clicks. "That's correct. The trust conversion was processed 4 years ago. This freeze request incorrectly cited trustee authority." Her voice took on a sharper edge. "Ms. Bradford, would you be available to come to our downtown branch this afternoon? I believe we need to review your account security protocols." "I'll be there at 1, I confirmed, already calculating how this affected our plans. Dakota was waiting at the service entrance when I arrived, her expression tight with concern. "Nate's been trying to reach you. Your building access isn't the only thing they've revoked. Your email has been disconnected, and IT is conducting what they're calling a security audit of all your files." "They're covering their tracks," I said grimly, following her through the service corridors. "And trying to cut off my resources. The bank just called about a freeze attempt on my accounts." Dakota's eyes widened. "That's beyond aggressive. That's desperate," I finished for her. "They know I won't go quietly, so they're trying to limit my options." I glanced at my watch. "Where's Nate now?" "Waiting in the small conference room on 12. It's off the main corridor. And your father will be tied up with the Petersons on 30 for at least another hour." We took the service elevator to the 12th floor, thankfully requiring only a general building access code rather than individual credentials. As we navigated the back hallways of Bradford Holdings, I was struck by how foreign the space felt already, as if my 15 years with the company had been erased overnight. Nate rose as we entered the conference room, his normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. "You need to see this," he said without preamble, sliding a document across the table. I scanned the page, my stomach dropping with each paragraph. It was an amendment to my grandfather's will, dated just 3 weeks before his death, dramatically altering the succession provisions we'd all understood to be in place. "This can't be real," I said, looking up at Nate. Grandfather and I discussed the succession plan extensively in his final months. He never mentioned any changes. "It appears genuine," Nate replied reluctantly. "The signature matches, and it was witnessed by your father and Bradley Wilson's father, Judge Wilson. The same Bradley Wilson who would be attending tonight's announcement dinner." The connections were becoming clearer by the minute. "Where did you find this?" I asked, examining the document more carefully. "It was delivered to my office this morning by courier. No cover letter, no explanation." Nate's discomfort was evident. "Vanessa, if this amendment is legitimate, it significantly strengthens the board's position." It explicitly names Richard as the preferred successor should the board determine he's prepared to assume leadership. "All convenient timing," Dakota observed acidly. "This document appears just when they need it most." I reread the critical passage, noting the precise legal language that created the loophole my father had exploited. The authenticity of the by amendment seemed plausible. It was drafted in my grandfather's characteristic style, with his preferred legal phrasings. And yet, "The date," I said suddenly, pointing to the document. "March 17th. Grandfather was in the hospital that entire week. I visited him daily." Nate frowned, leaning closer. "Are you certain? The witnesses have attested that this was signed at his home office." "Absolutely certain. He had pneumonia. They only released him on the 21st. I pulled out my phone, opening my calendar app and scrolling back. "Look, here are my hospital visit entries. And here's the reminder to pick up his prescription when he was discharged." Dakota was already typing furiously on her tablet. "The hospital would have admission records," she said. "If we can prove he was physically incapable of signing this document on the date indicated, it would invalidate the amendment entirely," Nate finished, his expression shifting from concern to calculating interest, "and potentially constitute fraud if your father knowingly presented a falsified document." The implications were staggering. If we could prove the amendment was fraudulent, it would not only undermine the board's decision, but could expose my father to serious legal consequences. "We need those hospital records," I said, already moving toward the door. Dakota, "On it," she confirmed. "My cousin works in medical records at Swedish. She can't access them directly, but she'll know the fastest legitimate way to request them." A soft knock at the conference room door froze us all in place. After a tense moment, the door opened to reveal Sophia Reeves, Bradford Holdings VP of Marketing and my father's most loyal executive ally. "I thought I might find you skulking about," she said, her perfectly painted lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your father would like to see you in his office, immediately." The demand was so absurdly presumptuous that I almost laughed. "I'm afraid I have a prior commitment," I replied coolly. Sophia's smile tightened. "He said you might say that. He also said to inform you that if you're not in his office in 5 minutes, he'll be forced to contact law enforcement regarding unauthorized access to the building and potential corporate espionage." "Corporate espionage?" Dakota echoed incredulously. "She's still the CEO until the board formally installs Richard." "That transition was completed this morning in an emergency session," Sophia replied, examining her manicure with studied casualness. "The paperwork is being finalized as we speak. So technically, Vanessa is no longer authorized to be in confidential meetings on Bradford property." Nate stepped forward, his bow tie slightly askew in his agitation. "As legal counsel for Bradford Holdings, I can assure you that proper protocols for leadership transition have not been followed. The board cannot simply—" "Perhaps you should join this meeting with Mr. Bradford," Sophia interrupted smoothly. "He mentioned having concerns about divided loyalties among certain executive staff." The threat was clear. Nate's position was also in jeopardy if he continued supporting me. I touched his arm gently. "It's all right, Nate. I'll speak with my father." To Sophia, I added, "You can tell him I'll be there in 15 minutes. I have a call to complete first." 5 minutes, she insisted. He was quite clear. "Then he can wait 10 extra minutes," I replied with a calm I didn't entirely feel. I'm sure he's had plenty of practice being disappointed by his children. Color rose in Sophia's cheeks at the direct challenge, but she merely inclined her head stiffly before withdrawing. "You can't seriously be considering meeting with him," Dakota protested once the door closed. "It's obviously a trap." "Of course it is," I agreed. "But it's also an opportunity. While I keep him occupied, you two can focus on obtaining those hospital records." I turned to Nate. "If this amendment is fraudulent, what's our next step?" He considered for a moment. We'd petition for an emergency injunction against the leadership change pending investigation of the succession documentation. It wouldn't reverse what's already happened, but it would pause any further actions, including that non-compete enforcement. How quickly could we file? If we had definitive proof, I could have the paperwork ready by end of day. I checked my watch. Nearly noon. Dakota, I need those records by 3 at the latest, and I need you to move my bank appointment to 4. Tell Harriet Moss it's urgent. What are you going to do? She asked, concern evident in her expression. I'm going to buy us time, I replied, gathering my things, and find out exactly how far my father is willing to go to maintain control of Bradford Holdings. The walk to my father's office on the 30th floor felt surreal, like moving through a familiar dream that had suddenly taken a nightmarish turn. Employees I'd worked alongside for years averted their eyes as I passed, conversations falling, silent in my wake. News of my ousting had clearly spread throughout the company, leaving a wake of awkward uncertainty. My father's executive assistant, a woman who had sent me birthday cards each year since I was 10, couldn't meet my gaze as she buzzed me into his office. He's expecting you, she murmured, her voice barely audible. The office that had once belonged to my grandfather remained largely unchanged since his tenure. The same imposing mahogany desk, the same wood-paneled walls adorned with architectural awards and family photos, the same sweeping view of Elliott Bay that had captivated me as a child. My father stood at the window, his back to the door, hands clasped behind him in a pose so reminiscent of my grandfather that for a moment my resolve faltered. Then he turned, revealing an expression not of anger, but of something more disturbing. Satisfaction. Vanessa, he said, as if we were meeting for a routine business discussion. Thank you for coming. Please sit down. I remained standing. I understand you've accelerated the timeline we discussed yesterday. He gestured dismissively. Merely a practical adjustment. Once the decision was made, it seemed prudent to execute the transition efficiently. Efficiency, I repeated. Is that what you call attempting to freeze my personal accounts? Or having me escorted through my own building like a criminal? A flicker of something, perhaps surprise that I'd discovered the account freeze so quickly, crossed his face, before his expression smoothed back to practice neutrality. Security protocols are standard in leadership transitions, he replied. As for your accounts, that was simply a precautionary measure while we audit company expenditures. My personal accounts have nothing to do with company expenditures. Don't they? He moved to his desk, opening a folder with deliberate slowness. Our preliminary review shows several concerning patterns of resource allocation under your management. The Westlake Arts District, for instance, appears to have benefited certain organizations with which you have personal connections. The implication was both clear and absurd. You're suggesting I embezzled funds through legitimate business investments that were approved by the board, including you? I'm suggesting, he said carefully, that your judgment may have been clouded by personal interests rather than shareholder value. The board simply wants to ensure all transactions were appropriate. It was a fishing expedition, a desperate attempt to find retroactive justification for actions already taken. But it was also dangerous. Even unfounded accusations of financial impropriety could damage my professional reputation beyond repair. What exactly do you want from this meeting? I asked directly. You've removed me from the company. You're attempting to restrict my finances. You've made your position abundantly clear. My father sat down behind his desk, gesturing again. To the chair opposite him. What I want is a civilized resolution to an unfortunate situation. The papers you were given yesterday, I'd like you to sign them today now that you've had time to review them. Including the non-compete? Especially the non-compete. His tone hardened slightly. Bradford Holdings has invested considerably in your professional development. It's only reasonable to expect some protection for that investment. The audacity of his framing, as if my 15 years of work had been a favor the company had done for me rather than the other way around, was breathtaking. And if I refuse? My father leaned back slightly, his expression growing cold. Then things will become unnecessarily complicated for everyone involved. Richard's welcome dinner tonight includes several key media figures. The narrative presented will shape public perception of this transition and of your departure. Whether you're remembered as a valued contributor who gracefully stepped aside for the designated Bradford heir, or as a disgruntled executive who was removed for concerning business practices is entirely within your control. The threat was unmistakable. Sign the papers and accept the pre-approved narrative, or face character assassination in the press. You would publicly disparage your own daughter to protect Richard's ego? I asked, genuine disbelief coloring my voice despite everything I'd already witnessed. I would protect this company and our family legacy from anyone who threatens it, he corrected, even if that person shares our name. I left my father's office without signing anything, his thinly veiled threats echoing in my ears. The sensation of being watched followed me through the executive floor, past Sophia's triumphant smirk and the averted gazes of colleagues who had celebrated project successes with me just a week earlier. My phone buzzed with a text from Dakota. Meet us at Harriet Moss's office, 2 p.m., breakthrough. The cryptic message carried a note of urgency that quickened my steps. Rather than taking the main elevator down to the lobby, I opted for the fire stairs, less visible, less chance of another confrontation. As I descended past the 24th floor, the door to the stairwell opened abruptly, revealing a familiar figure. Leonard Brooks, my father's younger brother and the black sheep of the family, who had resigned from Bradford Holdings nearly 15 years ago after a legendary falling out with my father. Uncle Leo? I froze mid-step, genuinely shocked to see him in the building. What are you doing here? He stepped into the stairwell, letting the heavy door swing shut behind him. At 61, Leo retained the rangy build and irreverent demeanor that had always set him apart from my father's rigid formality. His silver hair was pulled back in a short ponytail, and his outfit, jeans and a blazer rather than the requisite Brooks family suit, marked him as deliberately separate from the Bradford corporate identity. Causing trouble? Naturally, he replied with a wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. A family specialty, it seems, though I heard you've taken it to new heights. Despite everything, I found myself returning his smile. Uncle Leo had always been my favorite relative after my grandfather, the one who asked about my interests rather than my achievements, who brought me books about art history when everyone else gave me business biographies. Nothing like being forcibly removed from your own company to earn your troublemaker credentials, I said, the lightness in my tone belied by the tension I couldn't quite disguise. Leo's expression sobered. So it's true. Henry actually went through with it. You knew? The betrayal stung anew, thinking even Leo had been informed of my ousting before I was. He shook his head quickly. Only rumors. An old colleague still on the board mentioned succession planning was suddenly on the agenda. Given Richard's return from Europe, it wasn't hard to connect the dots. His gaze turned searching. How are you holding up? The simple inquiry, the first time anyone had asked about my well-being rather than my next strategic move, nearly undid my carefully maintained composure. I began, then faltered, unsure how to condense the maelstrom of the past 24 hours into a casual response. I'm figuring out my next steps. Leo nodded, understanding what I couldn't articulate. Your grandfather would be furious, he said quietly. This isn't what he intended. Apparently it was, I countered bitterly. They found an amendment to his will specifically naming Richard as his preferred successor. What amendment? Leo's surprise appeared genuine. William never mentioned any change to the succession plan in our conversations. You were in contact with grandfather? This was news to me. As far as I knew, Leo and my grandfather had maintained a cordial but distant relationship after Leo's departure from the company. More so in his final years, Leo confirmed. Monthly lunches at that little Italian place he loved in Pioneer Square. We had unfinished business to resolve. The revelation that my grandfather had been privately reconciling with Leo while maintaining public solidarity with my father added yet another layer of complexity to the family dynamics I thought I understood. The amendment is dated March 17th, I said, about 3 weeks before he died. Leo's brow furrowed. March 17th? That's impossible. William was in the hospital with pneumonia that entire week. I visited him twice. That's what I remembered. As well. A surge of hope rose within me. We're trying to obtain the hospital records to confirm. You don't need to, Leo said, reaching into his inner jacket pocket and withdrawing his phone. I've got proof right here. He scrolled through his photo gallery before turning the screen toward me. There was my grandfather in his hospital bed, looking frail but alert, the date stamp clearly showing March 17th. Leo had captured the hospital wristband in the frame, whether by accident or foresight. May I asked, gesturing to his phone. Leo handed it over without hesitation. I quickly forwarded the photo to myself, then returned the device. This could be crucial evidence, I told him. We suspect the amendment might be fraudulent. Knowing my brother, I wouldn't be surprised. Leo's expression darkened. Henry has always believed rules are malleable when they conflict with his vision for Bradford. A lifetime of hints and half-understood family tensions suddenly crystallized into clarity. Is that why you left the company? Because of Father's flexible ethics? Leo leaned against the stairwell wall, a familiar gesture that reminded me of how he would settle in for a long story when I was a child. Your father and I had different interpretations of our responsibilities to the family. Legacy, he said carefully. Henry believed preserving Bradford meant protecting what our father had built, exactly as he built it. I believed it meant evolving to remain relevant and ethical. The parallel to my own conflict with the board was unmistakable. The final straw was the portside development, Leo continued. I discovered Henry had knowingly proceeded with construction, despite environmental reports warning of contaminated soil that could leach into the Sound. When I confronted him, he said fixing the problem would delay the project by months and cost millions in remediation. What did you do? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. I leaked the reports to the Department of Ecology, Leo confirmed, a hint of old defiance flashing in his eyes. The project was halted, Bradford Holdings faced significant fines, and Henry never forgave me for prioritizing public safety over family loyalty. The Portside scandal had been carefully managed in family lore, described as an unfortunate regulatory complication rather than a deliberate ethical violation. Learning the truth after all these years was like watching puzzle pieces snap into place. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Why are you even here after 15 years of exile? Leo straightened, his expression resolute. Because history is repeating itself, and you deserve to know what you're really up against. And because your grandfather asked me to look out for you if anything happened to him. He what? This was perhaps the most surprising revelation yet. William knew Henry would never accept you as a permanent CEO, despite your qualifications. He hoped the succession plan would force the issue, but he always worried Henry would find a way around it. Leo's voice softened. He was very proud of you, Vanessa, said you had his vision but better judgment. The validation from beyond the grave brought a lump to my throat. Then why the amendment naming Richard? If such an amendment exists, I'd bet my last dollar it's a forgery, Leo said firmly. William was adamant that you were the future of Bradford. In fact, he hesitated. That's part of why I'm here today. William left something in my safekeeping. Something he asked me to give you if Henry ever moved against you. From his other inside pocket, Leo withdrew an envelope, yellowed slightly with age, with my name written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. He gave me this during his final hospital stay, Leo explained, handing it to me. Said it was insurance for your future. I've kept it in my safe deposit box until today. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of Bradford Holdings letterhead, dated 4 years earlier, just after my appointment as CEO. The letter, signed by my grandfather and notarized, outlined his explicit wishes for company succession, naming me as his chosen heir and detailing the reasoning behind his decision. But more significantly, the letter contained detailed instructions for a contingency I hadn't known existed, a separate trust, established outside the Bradford family holdings, containing what my grandfather called seed capital for new ventures, should Bradford Holdings ever prove too limiting for your vision. According to the letter, the trust held $20 million, accessible only to me, with no ties to the family business and no possibility of interference from the board. Did you know about this? I asked Leo, stunned by the revelation. He shook his head. William never shared the contents with me. He only said it was your safety net if you needed independence from the family. My grandfather, it seemed, had anticipated this moment, had prepared for the possibility that the company he built might someday reject the leadership he'd chosen, had ensured I would have resources to build something new if Bradford Holdings proved unwilling to evolve. This changes everything, I murmured, carefully folding the letter and returning it to the envelope. That was his intention, Leo replied with a small smile. William played the long game better than anyone I've ever known. My phone buzzed again, Dakota, wondering where I was. I need to go, I said, tucking the envelope securely into my bag. My team is waiting. Leo nodded. You should know that I didn't just come here to deliver that letter. I came to attend tonight's dinner. You're invited to Richard's celebration? I couldn't hide my surprise. Leo had been persona non grata at family events for as long as I could remember. Oh, Henry hasn't invited me, Leo clarified with a mischievous glint in his eye. But I received a rather intriguing call from Sarah Peterson this morning, asking if I'd care to join her table at Canlis this evening. Apparently, she's bringing several guests to what she described as a fascinating study in corporate governance. Understanding dawned. Sarah is attending the dinner? Along with representatives from 3 other Bradford Holdings client companies, Leo confirmed, all apparently interested in discussing the sustainable future of their partnerships. The implications were staggering. Sarah hadn't simply taken our earlier conversation to heart. She had mobilized her own influence network to create pressure on my father and the board. The dinner is supposed to be Richard's triumphant introduction as CEO, I said, thinking aloud. If key clients are publicly questioning the transition, it would dramatically undermine the narrative Henry is so desperate to control, Leo finished, particularly with business reporters present. For the first time since sitting in that conference room yesterday morning, I felt something like genuine hope. Not just determination to fight back, but actual optimism about the outcome. Thank you, Uncle Leo, I said, impulsively embracing him. For the letter, for the photo, for everything. He returned the hug awkwardly, patting my back with the discomfort of someone unaccustomed to familial affection. You've got more allies than you realize, Vanessa. Your grandfather made sure of that. As I continued down the stairs, the weight of the envelope in my bag felt like a talisman. Whatever happened with Bradford Holdings, I now had options my father couldn't control, resources he couldn't freeze, and validation from the person whose opinion had always mattered most. The game had changed yet again. But this time, the shift was in my favor. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. My meeting with Harriet Moss at Seattle First Bank confirmed what Uncle Leo's letter had revealed. The separate trust existed, fully funded, and completely segregated from Bradford family assets. More importantly, Harriet had already flagged and denied the suspicious freeze request on my personal accounts, recognizing it as potentially fraudulent. "Your father has no legal authority over your finances," she assured me, sliding a folder across her desk. "I've taken the liberty of preparing documentation to transfer your accounts to a different branch and implementing enhanced security protocols." By 4:30, Nate had filed an emergency petition with the court, challenging the Bradford Holdings leadership transition based on the evidence of the fraudulent will amendment. The hospital records Dakota had obtained corroborated Uncle Leo's photo, definitively proving my grandfather had been hospitalized when the document was supposedly signed at his home office. "The hearing is scheduled for Monday morning," Nate reported as we gathered in Mira's downtown office for a final strategy session. "It won't undo today's board actions immediately, but it creates significant legal jeopardy for your father and anyone else involved in presenting false documentation, including Judge Wilson," Dakota added grimly. "His signature as a witness on a document he couldn't possibly have observed being signed is a serious ethical violation. The Judicial Conduct Board will take great interest." The implications were seismic, potentially career-ending for several board members who had knowingly proceeded with the transition based on fraudulent documentation. Yet even with these developments, I felt strangely detached from the outcome at Bradford Holdings. The company that had consumed my life for 15 years suddenly seemed less important than what might come next. "Have you decided about tonight?" Mira asked, studying my expression carefully. "You don't have to attend that dinner, you know. Let the legal process handle this." I considered the question seriously. The Richard Brooks celebration dinner at Canlis represented everything I'd been fighting against. My family's determination to erase my contributions, their willingness to lie and manipulate to maintain control, their unshakable belief that the Bradford name belonged exclusively to its male heirs. I could stay away, focus on building something new with the resources my grandfather had provided, and let the courts expose my father's deception. It would be the sensible choice, the professional option. "I'm going," I said finally. Not to create a scene or confront my family, but because I've spent my entire life trying to earn a place at their table. Tonight, I'm claiming a seat on my own terms. Dakota looked worried. "Your father explicitly threatened to damage your reputation if you didn't cooperate. If you show up uninvited." "I'm counting on that," I replied, a plan crystallizing as I spoke. "He wants control of the narrative more than anything. Let's see how far he'll go when he's forced to choose between his precious family image and his desperate need to install Richard as CEO. At 7:15, I stepped out of a Blacktown car in front of Canlis, Seattle's most prestigious restaurant, perched dramatically on the slope of Queen Anne Hill, with sweeping views of Lake Union. The establishment had been a fixture of Bradford. Family celebrations for 3 generations, my grandparents' anniversary dinners, my parents' engagement, countless business successes. Tonight, it would serve as the stage for a very different kind of family event. I had chosen my outfit with strategic precision, a deep navy suit I'd worn to accept a business leadership award last year, paired with my grandmother's sapphire earrings, professional, confident, and unquestionably appropriate for the occasion. Nothing that could be dismissed as emotional or retaliatory. The maitre d' recognized me immediately. "Ms. Bradford," he greeted me with a professional smile that couldn't quite conceal his surprise. "We weren't expecting. That is, your party is gathered in the private dining room." "Thank you, Antoine. I know the way." I moved past him, before he could decide whether to alert my father to my arrival. Through the main dining room, past tables of Seattle's elite enjoying their 7-course tasting menus, toward the private space in the rear of the restaurant where the Bradford family hosted their most significant gatherings. The glass doors, revealed a scene of carefully orchestrated corporate theater, a horseshoe arrangement of tables allowing all guests to see the head table where my father sat with an empty chair beside him, presumably awaiting Richard's arrival. My mother was there, animated in conversation with Judge Wilson. Bradley Wilson, the business reporter, was positioned strategically near the center, notebook already open beside his wine glass. Board members and their spouses filled several tables, along with key executives who had obviously been deemed sufficiently loyal to witness this transition of power. And at a table near the window, exactly as Leo had described, sat Sarah Peterson with an assemblage of Bradford Holdings' most significant clients, including, surprisingly, 3 of the minority shareholders Nate had mentioned contacting. Uncle Leo was among them, looking entirely at ease as he charmed the group with what appeared to be an entertaining story. I took a steadying breath and pushed open the door. The reaction rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Conversations faltering mid-sentence, expressions cycling through surprise to discomfort to calculation as guests tried to determine how to respond to my unexpected appearance. My mother spotted me first, her practiced social smile freezing in place as she clutched my father's arm in warning. He turned, his expression darkening as he registered my presence. In 3 quick strides, he intercepted me before I could fully enter the room. "What are you doing here?" he demanded in a harsh whisper, steering me back toward the doorway. "This is a private event." "A private event celebrating my brother's appointment to the position I've held for 5 years?" I kept my voice pleasant, aware of the watching eyes. How could I possibly miss it? "This is inappropriate, Vanessa. You're creating an uncomfortable situation for our guests." "Am I? Or is the discomfort coming from the fraudulent documentation you used to justify this transition?" His face blanched slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The amended will dated March 17th, when grandfather was hospitalized with pneumonia," I clarified, watching his expression carefully. "The one witnessed by Judge Wilson, who's currently enjoying what appears to be an excellent Pinot Noir at your table." My father's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a commotion at the main entrance drew everyone's attention. Richard had arrived, slightly disheveled and 40 minutes late for his own celebration, his bow tie askew and his movements suggesting he'd enjoyed a few airport cocktails before joining the dinner. Sorry, he called out, waving expansively, as he surveyed the room. "Bloody flight delays. Has everyone started without—" He stopped abruptly as he spotted me. "Vanessa, didn't expect to see you here." The genuine surprise in his voice confirmed what I'd suspected. Richard had been as blindsided by the timing of this transition as I had been. My father had manipulated us both, positioning Richard as the beneficial puppet while consolidating his own control over the company. "I wouldn't miss my little brother's big moment," I replied smoothly, turning to face him. "Congratulations on your new position." Richard approached cautiously, clearly trying to read the room. Despite everything, I felt a flicker of sympathy for him. Richard had been shaped by our parents' expectations just as I had been, molded into the Bradford heir apparent through indulgence rather than challenge, but confined to a predetermined role nonetheless. "Thanks," he said, his usual bravado tempered by apparent confusion. "Bit sudden all this. Father only told me about the CEO thing last week when he asked me to cut my Europe trip short." My father's expression tightened further at this unscripted revelation. "Perhaps we should continue this family discussion privately," he suggested with forced cordiality. "Richard, why don't you greet our guests while Vanessa and I step outside for a moment?" "Actually," came a firm voice from across the room, "I believe we're all quite interested in this family discussion." Sarah Peterson had risen from her table, commanding the attention of the entire room with her authoritative presence. Particularly those of us who have significant business relationships with Bradford Holdings that appear to be in flux. My father's expression shifted from controlled annoyance to careful diplomacy. Sarah, I assure you, all client relationships remain our top priority during this standard leadership transition. Standard? Sarah's eyebrow arched skeptically. There's nothing standard about removing a successful CEO without notice, based on documentation of questionable authenticity and attempting to freeze her personal assets when she doesn't immediately comply. A shocked murmur rippled through the room. The Bradford reputation for impeccable business ethics, cultivated over 3 generations, was the company's most valuable intangible asset. The mere suggestion of impropriety from someone of Sarah Peterson's stature was devastating. That's a serious mischaracterization of recent events, my father countered, his voice hardening. Bradford Holdings has followed all proper governance procedures, including presenting a document supposedly signed by William Bradford while he was hospitalized. This came from Leo, who had joined Sarah at the center of the room. Fascinating procedure, Henry. Perhaps Judge Wilson would care to explain how he witnessed this miraculous signing. All eyes turned to Judge Wilson, whose florid complexion had drained to a sickly gray. As a respected jurist nearing retirement, his reputation for integrity was untouchable, or had been, until this moment. I think there's been some confusion, my father attempted, desperation creeping into his tone. The specific date on the document may contain a clerical error, but William's intentions were clear. Were they? I interrupted quietly, withdrawing my grandfather's letter from my bag. Because I have documentation suggesting his intentions were exactly the opposite of what you've claimed. The room had gone completely silent, the carefully orchestrated celebration transforming into an impromptu corporate tribunal. Even Richard looked stricken, finally grasping the magnitude of what our father had done in his name. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish with this public spectacle? My father demanded, abandoning pretense as his control of the situation slipped away. Embarrassing your family? Damaging your brother's moment? This is precisely the emotional decision-making that proves you're not suited to lead Bradford Holdings. I'm not trying to lead Bradford Holdings, I replied with unexpected calm. Not anymore. The simple statement hung in the air, shifting the energy of the confrontation in a way I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I saw uncertainty flicker across my father's expression. What does that mean? Richard asked, looking between us with growing concern. It means I'm stepping away from Bradford Holdings entirely, I clarified. Not because I was forced out, but because I've found a better path forward. I turned to address the room at large, particularly the clients and business associates who had witnessed this family drama unfold. For those who've worked with me over the past 5 years, I want to express my sincere gratitude for your partnership. Next week, I'll be announcing the formation of a new venture focused on the intersection of development, cultural preservation, and community enhancement, areas that have always been my passion. Sarah Peterson's satisfied nod told me she'd already anticipated this move. Several of the minority shareholders were exchanging interested glances. You can't compete with Bradford Holdings, my father interjected sharply. The non-compete clause is unenforceable when employment is terminated under fraudulent circumstances, Nate supplied from near the doorway, where he had quietly entered during the confrontation. As the petition we filed this afternoon clearly establishes. My father's face darkened with genuine anger. You would destroy everything our family has built over a matter of wounded pride? The accusation, so fundamentally disconnected from reality, would have wounded me deeply just a day earlier. Now, it merely confirmed how completely he had failed to understand me, perhaps had never tried to understand me at all. I'm not destroying anything, Father, I replied gently. I'm building something new, something that honors grandfathers. Legacy of innovation and integrity while creating space for the values this company has increasingly abandoned. I turned to Richard, whose expression had shifted from confusion to a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The company is yours now. I hope you'll lead it with more vision than our father has shown, and more awareness of its potential impact beyond profit margins. For a long moment, the private dining room remained frozen in tableau. My father standing rigidly by the head table, my mother's hand pressed against her mouth in distress, Richard looking oddly displaced in the celebration that was ostensibly in his honor. The assembled guests seemed collectively uncertain whether to proceed with the dinner or make discreet exits. The spell was broken by Antoine, the maître d', who entered with impeccable timing and apparent obliviousness to the tension. "Mr. Bradford, shall we begin serving the first course?" he inquired politely. My father cleared his throat, visibly, struggling to regain his composure. "Yes, of course. Everyone, please take your seats." The ritual of the meal provided welcome structure for the socially awkward situation. Guests shuffled to their assigned tables. The waitstaff began circulating with wine and appetizers, and the volume of conversation gradually rose to mask the undercurrent of discomfort. I made my way toward Sarah Peterson's table, where Uncle Mai. Leo had already saved me a seat. "Magnificent entrance," he murmured as I sat down. "William would have been proud." "I'm not sure causing a scene at Canlis would have met with grandfather's approval," I replied dryly. "Not the scene," Leo clarified. "The dignity, the clarity of purpose. Those were qualities he valued above all else." Sarah Peterson nodded, in agreement. "Your grandfather once told me that true leadership isn't about controlling others, but about having such a clear vision that others naturally follow. You demonstrated that tonight." The validation warmed me, but I couldn't help glancing toward the head table where my parents sat in strained silence while Richard attempted to engage with Bradley Wilson, whose journalistic instincts were clearly at war with his social connection to the family. "I should speak with Richard," I said suddenly. "He's as much a pawn in this as I was." Leo looked skeptical. "Perhaps, but he was a willing pawn. He could have declined the position when he realized how it was being orchestrated." "Could he?" I wondered aloud. "Richard has never known any path but the one laid out for him. At least I had grandfather's alternative vision and support." Before anyone could respond, my mother appeared beside our table, her social mask firmly in place despite the slight tremor in her hands. "Vanessa," she said quietly. "A word, please?" The request, not a demand, not an order, but an actual request, was so unexpected that I found myself rising automatically to follow her to a small alcove near the restaurant's entrance, away from the curious eyes of the dinner guests. Once we were alone, her carefully composed expression faltered. "What your father did was wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to know I didn't approve of his methods." The admission stunned me. In 34 years, I had never heard my mother contradict my father on any matter of significance. "But you didn't stop him," I pointed out, trying to keep accusation from my tone. She looked away, her profile sharply defined against the darkened window. "No, I didn't stop him." The simple acknowledgement hung between us, neither an apology nor a justification, but perhaps the most honest exchange we'd ever had. "Why now?" I asked. "Why are you telling me this now?" She turned back to me, and I was startled to see genuine distress in her eyes. "Because watching you stand up to him tonight made me realize how rarely I've done the same. And because—" She hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic directness. "Because I'm afraid this breach between you may be permanent, and I don't want to lose my daughter even if your father is willing to sacrifice that relationship for Bradford Holdings." The vulnerability in her statement caught me off guard. My mother had always been a secondary character in the Bradford family drama, the elegant hostess, the supportive wife, the woman who enforced social norms and maintained appearances. I had never considered that she might have her own concerns, her own regrets. I'm not trying to cut ties with the family, I said carefully. But I can't pretend nothing happened. Father was willing to destroy my professional reputation and financial independence to control the company narrative. I know. She reached out tentatively, adjusting the collar of my suit in a rare maternal gesture. Henry has always believed the ends justify the means when it comes to Bradford. It's how his father operated, and he knows no other way. That doesn't make it right. No, she agreed simply. It doesn't. We stood in silence for a moment, the muted sounds of the dinner continuing in the background, crystal clinking against crystal, polite laughter, the subdued hum of a gathering determined to normalize an extraordinary situation. "What will you do now?" my mother finally asked. "Build something of my own," I replied. "Cultural impact partners will focus on the projects Bradford Holdings always deemed too community-centered, too preservation-minded." "Using your grandfather's secret trust," she said, surprising me again. "I knew about it, you know. William told me after he established it. He wanted someone else in the family to know it existed in case." She didn't finish the sentence. "In case Father tried to block my access to it," I completed for her. She nodded slightly, neither confirming nor denying. "Will you come to Sunday dinner next week? Richard wants to speak with you properly, away from all this." She gestured vaguely toward the dining room. The invitation represented a crossroads. I could refuse, drawing a firm boundary between my new path and my family's expectations. Or I could accept, maintaining the relationship despite everything that had happened. Neither choice seemed entirely right or wrong. "I'll consider it," I said finally. "But I need some distance first." She accepted this with a small nod. "That's fair. When you're ready, we'll be there." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I'm sorry, Vanessa, for not being the advocate you deserved." Before I could respond to this unprecedented apology, she turned and made her way back to the head table, her posture impeccable, offering no outward sign of the momentous exchange that had just taken place. I remained in the alcove a moment longer, processing this new dimension of family complexity, before returning to Sarah's table. The dinner continued with superficial normality, though the undercurrents of tension remained palpable throughout. The carefully choreographed courses. My father did not approach me again, maintaining rigid formality as he introduced Richard to key clients and associates. To his credit, Richard appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the charade, his responses growing more stilted as the evening progressed. As dessert was being served, my grandfather's favorite dark chocolate soufflé, a Bradford celebration tradition, Richard suddenly excused himself from the head table and made his way toward me. Our father half rose as if to stop him, then subsided under the weight of too many watching eyes. "Could we step outside for a minute?" Richard asked, gesturing toward the restaurant's famed terrace overlooking the lake. I nodded, following him through the glass doors into the cool evening air. The Seattle skyline glittered across the water, the Space Needle illuminated against the night sky. For a moment, we stood in silence, the familiar view evoking memories of countless family celebrations that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. "I didn't know," Richard said finally. "About the will amendment, the account freeze, any of it. Father called me in London last week. Said grandfather had designated me as successor and the board was ready to make the transition. That's all I knew until tonight." I studied my brother's face, noting the genuine distress in his expression. Richard had always been transparent in his emotions, unlike our father, who cultivated inscrutability as a business asset. "I believe you," I said simply. He blinked, clearly surprised by my ready acceptance. "You do?" "You've never been particularly good at deception, Richard. It's actually one of your better qualities." A reluctant smile tugged at his mouth. "Not ideal for a CEO, according to Father's endless lectures." Perhaps Bradford Holdings needs more transparency, not less, I suggested. The company has operated behind closed doors for too long, making decisions that affect communities without their input. Richard leaned against the terrace railing, his posture deflating slightly. I'm not qualified for this position, Vanessa. We both know it. I barely understand our core business model, let alone your initiatives with sustainable development and community integration. The frank admission was so unexpected that I momentarily struggled for a response. Richard had spent his entire life being told he was destined to lead Bradford Holdings. To hear him acknowledge his limitations represented a level of self-awareness I hadn't credited him with. You could learn, I offered. You're not incapable, Richard. You've just never been required to apply yourself to anything difficult. He considered this, looking out over the water. Maybe. But that doesn't change the fact that you're the one who should be running the company. You're the one who saved it when Father's outdated strategies nearly drove us into bankruptcy. You're the one Grandfather trusted. And yet, here we are, I said, without bitterness. You're the CEO of Bradford Holdings, and I'm starting a new venture that will probably compete directly with some of your developments. Richard turned to face me directly. What if I don't want to be CEO? What if I resign tomorrow, told the board I'm not accepting the position? The possibility hung between us, tempting and treacherous. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine returning to Bradford Holdings triumphantly, reinstated as CEO, vindicating my grandfather's faith in me. Then I thought about what that would actually mean. Fighting the same battles with my father and the old guard on the board, compromising my vision to accommodate their resistance, continuing the exhausting struggle to modernize a company that was fundamentally attached to its traditional identity. No, I said finally. Bradford Holdings is yours now, for better or worse. Make it what you want it to be, not what Father demands. And what about us? Richard asked quietly. We've never been close, Vanessa. I know that's largely my fault. I was jealous of your relationship with Grandfather, resentful of how easily everything seemed to come to you. Easily? I couldn't help the incredulous laugh that escaped me. Richard, I've worked 14-hour days for 15 years trying to prove I belonged at Bradford. Nothing about it was easy. He had the grace to look abashed. I meant it seemed easy to me. You always knew exactly what you wanted, exactly who you were. I never did. I just tried to be what everyone expected. The insight into my brother's perspective was illuminating. Where I had seen privileged indulgence, he had experienced purposeless drift. Where I had fought for recognition, he had struggled with expectations he felt unequipped to meet. Maybe we both needed to step away from the Bradford legacy to figure out who we really are, I suggested. Richard nodded slowly. I think I'd like to try running the London office for a while, away from Father's direct oversight. Focus on international expansion, learn the business properly. That might be a good first step, I agreed. Distance can provide clarity. And maybe, he hesitated, maybe our companies could collaborate on certain projects, your cultural preservation expertise with Bradford's development resources. The suggestion was unexpected, but not unwelcome. I'd be open to discussing specific opportunities, I said cautiously. Once Cultural Impact Partners is established, and Bradford Holdings has demonstrated a genuine commitment to ethical development. Richard extended his hand formally, a gesture that seemed simultaneously childish and sincere. To new beginnings, then. Both professionally and as siblings. I took his hand, feeling the strange weight of this moment. Not a complete reconciliation, but an acknowledgement of possibility. To new beginnings. As we returned to the dining room, I noticed my father watching our interaction with an inscrutable expression. Whatever he had hoped to achieve with tonight's celebration, it had certainly not included his children finding common ground independent of his influence. Sarah Peterson raised her glass slightly as I rejoined her table, a quiet salute to whatever she had observed transpiring on the terrace. Families are complicated ecosystems, she commented as I sat down. Sometimes the most disruptive events lead to the healthiest long-term adaptations. Uncle Leo chuckled. Sarah, you've been spending too much time with those environmental scientists at your manufacturing plant. Not everything needs a biological metaphor. On the contrary, Sarah countered with a smile. The principles of adaptation and evolution apply remarkably well to both business and family dynamics. Wouldn't you agree, Vanessa? I glanced across. The room at my family, my father rigid with controlled fury, my mother watching me with newfound consideration, Richard looking simultaneously lost and relieved as he fielded questions from Bradley Wilson. I think, I said carefully, that some relationships evolve, some become extinct, and some discover entirely new forms when the environment changes dramatically enough. The evening was drawing to a close, the carefully planned celebration having devolved into something no one had anticipated. As guests began making their farewells, I felt a strange lightness replacing the anger and betrayal that had driven me for the past 2 days. Bradford Holdings was no longer mine to save or reshape. That burden and opportunity now belonged to Richard. My path lay elsewhere, undefined but filled with possibilities my grandfather had foreseen even when I couldn't. As I prepared to leave, Dakota appeared at the restaurant entrance, right on cue for our prearranged departure. Everything all right? She asked quietly, taking in the subdued atmosphere of the concluding dinner. Nothing is all right, I replied, truthfully. But strangely, that feels exactly as it should be. 6 months later, I stood on the rooftop garden of the Westlake Arts District's central building, watching as artists, community members, and business leaders mingled against the backdrop of Seattle's skyline. The spring evening was unseasonably warm, the sunset painting the sky in hues that matched the champagne being served to celebrate Cultural Impact Partners' official launch. In the month since that fateful dinner at Canlis, my life had transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined when my father first slid those inheritance documents across the conference table. The legal fallout had been swift and consequential. Judge Wilson announced his early retirement amid an ethics investigation. My father avoided formal censure only through a carefully negotiated settlement that included his resignation as chairman of Bradford Holdings, though he remained on the board in a diminished capacity. The forged amendment to my grandfather's will was officially invalidated, though by then it hardly mattered. I had already committed to my new path. Richard had surprised everyone by following through on his terrace promise, relocating to London, to run Bradford's international division rather than assuming the CEO role in Seattle. The board had appointed an interim CEO, a respected industry veteran who had previously retired from a competitor firm, while conducting a proper executive search. The company was stable, if somewhat diminished in local influence. But tonight wasn't about Bradford Holdings. Tonight was about celebrating what had emerged from its shadow. Quite the turnout, Mira observed, appearing at my side with 2 glasses of champagne. She handed me one, casting an appraising eye over the gathering. The mayor, 2 city council members, Seattle's cultural elite, and, is that the dean of architecture from the university? I nodded, accepting the glass. Sarah Peterson made some introductions. Turns out preserving historic buildings while creating affordable spaces for artists is a popular concept with civic leaders. Who would have thought? Mira's tone was playfully sarcastic. It's almost as if community-centered development with environmental consciousness might actually be viable. Radical concept, I agreed, unable to suppress a smile. Clearly doomed to failure. Dakota joined us, tablet in hand as always. The Belltown warehouse conversion is officially funded, she reported, visibly pleased. The investment group was so impressed with tonight's presentation that they committed to the full amount, with potential for Phase 2 funding if initial occupancy targets are met. That's our third project fully greenlit, Mira noted. Not bad for a company that didn't exist 6 months ago. The swift success of Cultural Impact Partners had exceeded even my optimistic projections. My grandfather's seed funding had provided the foundation, but it was the network of relationships I'd built over 15 years, with investors, community organizations, and local government, that had truly accelerated our growth. That and the team we'd assembled. Dakota had joined as Chief Operations Officer, bringing her organizational genius and institutional knowledge. Nate had left Bradford Holdings to become our legal counsel, eager to support an organization whose values aligned with his own. 3. Former Bradford project managers had followed, drawn by our mission and the opportunity to work without the constraints of outdated corporate thinking. The Seattle Business Journal piece certainly didn't hurt, Dakota added, nodding toward Bradley Wilson, who was deep in conversation with one of our community partners near the herb garden. His profile on Seattle's development disruptor generated investor interest from as far away as Chicago and Toronto. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same reporter my father had invited to announce Richard's ascension had instead chronicled my emergence as an independent force in Seattle's development landscape. Bradley had approached me 3 weeks after the canless dinner, seeking an exclusive on what he called the development story of the decade. His subsequent article had been fair, thoughtful, and instrumental in establishing Cultural Impact Partners. Credibility. Ms. Bradford? A voice interrupted our conversation. I turned to find Lucia Reyes, the journalist whose breakfast interview had been my first step toward independence. I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to personally congratulate you. This, she gestured around the rooftop garden to the arts district below, is exactly the vision you described that morning. It's rare to see someone articulate a dream and then manifest it so completely. Thank you, Lucia. That means a great deal coming from you. Her profile in Innovator magazine had been instrumental in shaping public perception of my departure from Bradford as a positive evolution rather than an unceremonious ousting. I'm working on a follow-up piece about ethical development and community integration, she continued. Would you be open to another interview? I'd love to hear how your perspective has evolved since establishing your own company. I'd be happy to, I agreed. Dakota can arrange something for next week. As Lucia moved away to rejoin her colleagues, I caught sight of Uncle Leo near the rooftop edge, deep in conversation with an elderly woman I recognized as the director of the Seattle Preservation Society. He had become an unexpected but valuable advisor to Cultural Impact Partners, his decades of industry experience complemented by a genuine passion for ethical business practices. You're 10 o'clock, Dakota murmured discreetly. New arrivals. I turned to see my mother and Richard stepping onto the rooftop, both looking slightly uncertain amid the celebration already in full swing. Their presence was unexpected. I had sent them invitations out of courtesy, not expecting either to attend an event that so clearly represented my break from Bradford Holdings. Excuse me, I said to Mira and Dakota, making my way across the crowded rooftop. Richard spotted me first, raising a hand in awkward greeting. He looked different, more relaxed in casual business attire rather than the formal suits our father insisted upon, his expression open rather than guarded. Vanessa, my mother greeted me with a tentative smile. This is quite impressive. Congratulations. Thank you, I replied, genuine but reserved. We had spoken only a handful of times since the canless dinner, our Sunday dinner plans repeatedly postponed by mutual unspoken agreement. I'm surprised to see you both here. Surprised enough that security almost didn't let us up, Richard said with a wry smile. Apparently we weren't on the approved list. An oversight, I assured them, though we both knew it hadn't been. The formal invitation had been my only concession to family obligation. I hadn't actually expected them to accept. I flew in from London yesterday, Richard explained. Wanted to see this arts district you've been so passionate about. The real estate publications across the pond have been covering your adaptive reuse model quite extensively. The revelation was surprising. I didn't realize cultural impact partners had international attention. Development circles are small, and innovative approaches travel quickly, Richard replied. Our London team is considering something similar for a former industrial area in East London. I was hoping we might discuss potential collaboration while I'm in town. The suggestion caught me off guard. 6 months ago, I would have dismissed it outright as either a ploy or a Bradford Holdings attempt to co-opt my vision. Now, with the security of my own established company and the distance of half a year, I could consider it more objectively. I'd be open to a preliminary conversation, I said carefully, depending on the specific parameters and ethical commitments. Richard nodded, understanding my reservations. Of course, no pressure, just exploration of possibilities. Bradford International is establishing its own identity, separate from Seattle headquarters. My mother had remained quiet during this exchange, her gaze traveling over the rooftop garden and the Arts District buildings visible below. Your grandfather would have loved this, she said suddenly. He always believed development should enhance communities, not simply extract value from them. The observation, so simply stated yet profound in its acknowledgement, created an unexpected lump in my throat. Thank you for saying that, I managed. It means a lot. A momentary silence fell between us, filled with the ambient sounds of the party, conversation, laughter, the subtle background music selected to complement rather than dominate the gathering. Is Father here as well? I finally asked, glancing toward the entrance. My mother shook her head. No, Henry is struggling to adapt to recent changes. His identity has been so completely intertwined with Bradford Holdings for so long that he can't yet separate himself from it, even partially. The diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the reality. My father was unable or unwilling to witness my success independent of the company he had tried to keep from me. It wasn't surprising, but the confirmation still carried a dull ache of finality. Perhaps someday, Richard offered, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. When things have settled further? I nodded, allowing the comforting fiction that time alone would heal such fundamental differences in values and vision. Some breaches were simply too profound for conventional reconciliation. May I see more of the district? My mother asked, changing the subject with practiced social grace. Richard mentioned some of the buildings date back to the early 1900s. Of course, I replied, grateful for the shift. Dakota can arrange a proper tour, or I can show you some highlights myself once I've greeted a few more guests. I'd like that, she said with unexpected warmth, to see it through your eyes. As I guided them further into the celebration, introducing them to key team members and community partners, I was struck by how different this felt from our typical family interactions. Here, in the world I'd created, the Bradford name carried no special weight. I was valued for my vision and execution, not for my heritage. My mother and Richard were guests rather than authorities, observers rather than arbiters. The realization brought with it a profound sense of peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of authenticity. The freedom to define success on my own terms, to build relationships based on shared values rather than obligation. Later, as the celebration continued into evening and the city, lights began to sparkle below. I found myself alone for a moment near the rooftop edge, contemplating the journey of the past 6 months. From the devastating conference room revelation to tonight's successful launch had been a path of continuous reinvention, of shedding inherited expectations to discover my genuine priorities. Penny for your thoughts, came Uncle Leo's voice, as he joined me at the railing. Though given current market conditions, I should probably offer at least $1. I smiled at the familiar humor, just reflecting on how completely everything has changed since that day in the stairwell. Has it? Leo questioned, his expression thoughtful. Or have circumstances simply aligned to reveal what was always true beneath the surface? This philosophical query was typical of our conversations over recent months, as Leo had shifted from distant relative to valued mentor. Maybe both, I conceded. The situation forced me to confront truths I might otherwise have continued to ignore. For years, about the company, about my family, about what I really wanted to build. Leo nodded, gazing out at the city skyline where the Bradford building still stood prominently among newer structures. William used to say that true wealth isn't what you inherit but what you create. By that measure, you may be the richest Bradford yet. The observation settled around me, not as validation but as illumination, casting new light on the path I'd traveled and the one stretching ahead. Not Bradford, I corrected gently. Cultural Impact Partners doesn't carry the family name. That was a deliberate choice. The legacy isn't in the name, Leo countered. It's in the values. The commitment to building something meaningful that outlasts individual ambition. In that sense, you're carrying forward what was best about William's vision while leaving behind what limited it. From across the rooftop, I could see Mira signaling that it was time for my closing remarks to the gathered supporters and partners. Dakota was already organizing people near the small stage area, her efficiency ensuring the event would conclude as seamlessly as it had begun. I should go wrap things up, I told Leo. Will you stay for the final toast? Wouldn't miss it, he assured me. This is just the beginning, you know. What you're building here will reshape how development happens in this city, maybe beyond. As I made my way toward the stage, I passed my mother and Richard, now deep in conversation with Sarah Peterson. My mother caught my eye and offered a small, genuine smile. Not the practiced social expression I'd grown up with, but something more authentic. I returned it briefly before continuing forward, neither clinging to past wounds nor pretending they didn't exist. The future of our relationship remained uncertain, a work in progress like the buildings we were renovating below, structures with good bones but requiring careful attention to realize their potential. Standing before the gathered crowd of supporters, investors, artists, and community members, I felt a profound sense of arrival, not at a destination, but at a true beginning. The inheritance I'd been forced to surrender had led me to claim something far more valuable. The freedom to create on my own terms, guided by values I'd chosen rather than inherited. Thank you all for being here tonight, I began, my voice carrying clearly across the rooftop garden. 6 months ago, Cultural Impact Partners existed only as an idea, a belief that development could honor history while creating future opportunities, that profit and community benefit could align rather than conflict. Looking out at the diverse gathering, from artists who would occupy the studios below to investors who had recognized the financial viability of our vision, I felt a surge of gratitude for this unlikely coalition. Tonight, we're celebrating not just the launch of a company, but the beginning of a movement to transform how we think about urban spaces. The buildings in this arts district have stood for over a century, witnessing Seattle's evolution from frontier town to global city. Our commitment is to ensure they stand for another century, not as monuments to the past, but as living spaces, where creation continues. As I raised my glass for the final toast, my gaze swept across the rooftop, past Mira's proud smile, Dakota's satisfied nod, Uncle Leo's knowing gaze, my mother's tentative warmth, and Richard's genuine interest, to settle on the cityscape beyond, where my new venture would make its mark in ways my father had never imagined and never valued. To creating impact that outlasts us all, I offered, the simple toast encompassing everything that had brought us to this moment. As glasses raised in response and the words echoed back from dozens of voices, I recognized that what had begun as a devastating loss had transformed into the most valuable gift I could have received. The opportunity to build something truly my own, a legacy defined not by what I'd inherited, but by what I'd chosen to create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.